moving into chapter 7, which is on the immune system, I think the immune system is fascinating. The first time I ever took anatomy and physiology was a long, long time ago, and they didn't know all that much about the immune system and or the nervous system for that matter. And so later on, when I took it again later on, there was a lot more about the immune system. I thought, oh, that's very interesting. So we're not going to go into hideous, horrible detail. We're going to try to hit the high points, and we're going to talk about immune system disorders and a little bit about how that is going to affect our therapy sessions. So let's get into it. So I want you to be able to describe the normal immune response, to compare and contrast active and passive immunity. And we'll talk about the different types of immunity. Identify the role of cells involved in the immune response and which cells participate in both cellular and humoral immunity. And we'll talk about what those are. So cells are kind of the basis of the immune system. When we talk about the immune system, in the inflammation chapter, I talked about the different levels of protection that our body has. And we had the non-specific levels, so like our skin barrier, and then the non-specific response to something and inflammation, and then specific responses. And so the immune system is what provides the specific response. So it's responsible, the immune system is responsible for body defenses. The cells of the immune system are part of the non-specific response in the form of phagocytosis and inflammation. And they're also part of the specific response, which is production of specific antibodies against foreign substances and cells that specifically target foreign substances and problems within the body, such as neoplasias and tumors, that sort of thing. So the immune system consists of lymphoid structures, immune cells, tissues concerned with immune cell development, and chemical mediators. So we've got tissues involved, we've got cells involved, and we've got chemical mediators involved. So we know that chemical mediators are the ways that cells communicate with one another. So we have to have that. And the cells have to get to the site of action. So our circulatory system is involved, of course. And like so many systems in the body, everything's involved. So you can't just slice that out and say that's how it all works, or you can't just say one part is responsible. It's everything. So the lymphoid structures of the immune system include the lymph nodes, which are all over your body, the spleen, which is over there by your stomach and pancreas, the tonsils, and the intestinal lymphoid tissues. So there's a group of lymphoid tissues called Peyer's patches that are in the small intestine. And the lymphatic circulation. So the lymphatic circulation, it plays a big part in the immune system because that's that fluid response again that we're talking about. So those are kind of the structures that the immune response functions within. The immune cells or lymphocytes so there are B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, different. We'll talk about the different types of cells, as well as macrophages provide specific mechanisms for the identification and removal of foreign material. So how do we identify it? Well, those cells, the cells are what do it. There are tissues that involve immune cell production and development, including bone marrow and the thymus. All immune cells originate in the bone marrow. So when someone has a bone marrow transplant, they have to develop all new immune system, brand new. When you're you're a brand new baby, you just were born, you have to develop your immune system. And so our immune cells originate in the bone marrow, and then some of them mature in the bone marrow and some are mature in the thymus. And the thymus is significant during fetal development. It basically, during fetal development, the thymus is programming the immune cells to recognize itself, say like, okay, you're developing into a human being here, you got to know self from non-self. So that's a pretty important role. Interesting thing, when the immune system was first starting to be studied, somebody noticed that children have a larger thymus gland than adults, and so they said, "Oh, there must be something wrong. We should probably take part of that out." Wrong, but children have a larger thymus gland because they're working on developing their immune system, and that's also why children get sick more often, because they have to be exposed to pathogens, mount an immune response, and save that information for the next time they're exposed to that pathogen. So when your body can't recognize self versus non-self, that's a problem. So we'll talk about that when we talk about disorders. Chemical mediators include chemicals such as histamines, which is involved in the immune response or the inflammatory response as well. And interleukins, they play a major role in the body's immune reaction. And the chemical mediators are how the cells communicate with each other. So there's a table, you know how I like those green tables in the book. And it's table 7.1, major components of the immune system and their function. Really, that list of things there is the depth that you need to know. So no deeper than that. That one chart kind of sums it all up and what the cells do. So when you look at it, you say, well, gosh, what does a macrophage do? And you look on that chart, table 7.1, and it says macrophages are responsible for phagocytosis. They process and present antigens to the lymphocytes for the immune response. That's what you got to know about macrophages. Next quarter, when we start talking about some of the other things, some of the roles of macrophages in healing, we'll go into a little more detail. But for right now, that's what you need to know about the macrophages' function in the immune system. So our immune response, when I said that kids have to be exposed to pathogens so then they can develop an immune response and then save that information for later, here's how it works. So the primary response is the first exposure to an antigen. So here I am with my brand new immune system, and I get exposed to the common cold or anything. It takes the immune system 1 to 2 weeks before it develops enough antibodies to reach efficacy, to be effective against that. So that's why little kids get sick more when they're exposed to things. The secondary response, so once your body mounted the primary response, develops those antibodies, it saves that information in a B memory cell for the secondary response. So repeat exposure to the same antigen, the immune system flips through its Rolodex of cells and says, "Oh, I've got this one. I know how to make the antibodies for it. Let's do it." So you get a more rapid response. You get efficacy within 1 to 3 days, which is pretty handy. You can develop the antibodies pretty quickly. The only time that is a problem is when the antigen is something that can kill you on the primary response. So that's the issue that we had with COVID in early 2020, is nobody had an exposure to it to start with. It was a new virus that the human race had not encountered before. And so if the primary response kills you, you never get to develop a secondary response. So that's how COVID got a lot of people, unfortunately. But now most of us hopefully have been vaccinated, and that your vaccination is your primary response. So then when you get exposed, your secondary response is a lot faster, and hopefully it won't kill you. So the cells of the immune system include macrophages. Macrophages are pretty handy little cells. They're just cruising around in the circulatory system waiting for something to happen. So the macrophages are critical in the initiation of the immune response. So they develop from monocytes. So in chapter 10, at the beginning of next quarter, we're going to talk about the development of individual white and red blood cells. So put that on the shelf for now. But monocytes are a precursor cell, and they develop into macrophages. And the it's part of the mononuclear phagocytotic system, is what they call it. So the macrophages sort of cruise around. They hang out in different areas of the body: the liver, the lungs, the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are basically like immune cell nightclubs or social clubs. They hang out there and they wait until something happens. So they're throughout the body, and when they encounter foreign material, they engulf it. That's the phagocytosis process. And then what they do is they process the antigens on the foreign material, so basically the identifiers of those foreign cells, and they display it on their cell membranes for the immune system to recognize. So they go, okay, I found this new thing. Do you recognize it? The immune system's like, I don't, maybe yes, maybe no. And we'll see about how they recognize it later. Besides that, displaying antigens, they also secrete chemical transmitters. So monokines, interleukins, they play a role in the activation of additional lymphocytes in the inflammatory response and secondary immune response. So macrophages that kind of have their hand in everything, and they also play a role in healing. So they're nifty little cells to have around. And if you don't have enough macrophages, that could be a problem. Probably not going to mount a good immune response. So the primary cell of the immune response is the lymphocyte. And so leukocytes are white blood cells, erythrocytes are red blood cells, thrombocytes are platelets. But lymphocytes are a category of leukocytes. So all leukocytes are produced in the bone marrow. Mature lymphocytes are called immunocompetent cells, meaning they can perform their function of recognizing and reacting with antigens in the body. The two groups of lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes and the T lymphocytes, perform two different types of functions, and we'll talk about each one. So it's either going to be cell-mediated immunity or humoral immunity. So T lymphocytes, and the T and the B stand for where they mature. So T lymphocytes mature in the thymus. B lymphocytes mature in the bone marrow. So T lymphocytes are responsible for cellular immunity. There are a lot of different kinds of them, but they are born in the bone marrow, they migrate to the thymus, and they mature in the thymus, or they're further differentiated in the thymus. So they're from bone marrow stem cells, just like all the other leukocytes. And they participate in cell-mediated immunity. So there are different types of T cells. There are cytotoxic killer T cells, and those are pretty handy ones to have around. They actively destroy antigens. They actively destroy cancer cells and virus-infected cells. So they're going out there. So one of the reasons why people are more prone to developing cancers when they're older is they don't have as many cytotoxic T killer cells. There are also helper T cells, which help activate other lymphocytes. And they can act as suppressors to control or limit a specific immune response, or they can act as enhancers. So they're little worker bees. They're helping out. Memory T cells remember an antigen, and they quickly stimulate the immune response on re-exposure. So there are two different types of memory cells. They're B memory cells and T memory cells. So T lymphocytes are called cell-mediated immunity because they go directly out to the antigen. The cell goes out there and kills that virus-infected cell, kills that cancer cell, or gets rid of the antigen. So it's the cell taking the action. The other kind of immune response is the humoral response. So the B lymphocytes are responsible for the humoral response. Basically what B lymphocytes do is they produce antibodies, and immunoglobulins are that's the chemical name for the antibodies. So they're thought to mature in the bone marrow. That's where the B comes from. And then they proceed to the spleen and lymphoid tissue to wait until they're activated. So plasma cells are B memory cells that have been stimulated to produce antibodies, or are B cells, and B memory cells form a clone of themselves to create a plasma cell. So after exposure to antigens, with the assistance of those helper T lymphocytes, they become those antibody producing plasma cells. So B lymphocytes act primarily against bacteria and viruses that are outside the body cells. So the T lymphocyte, the T lymphocyte killer cells, the cytotoxic cells, they can act on body cells gone wrong, as well as foreign antigens. B cells mostly act on foreign antigens, so bacteria and virus and things from outside the body. So B memory cells, they provide for repeated production of antibodies, and they form that part of the humoral response. So the B memory cells, they're like our little filing system of antigens. There are memory, like I was exposed to this before, and here's the antibody for it. And I'm going to split off a plasma cell, and it's going to just produce antibodies. So that's pretty handy. So antibodies. So the humoral immunity are antibodies that are produced to protect the body. The cell-mediated immunities, where the lymphocytes are programmed to attack non-self cells or weird self cells to protect the body. So one of them, the antibodies are doing the work, the cells are producing the antibodies, and the other one, the cells doing the work. So hopefully that makes sense. So I don't have a slide for antibodies, but antibodies are basically, they're a specific class of proteins. They're called immunoglobulins. They're present in different body fluids, and each has a unique sequence of amino acids that binds to an antigen to basically to tag it. They're little tags for destruction. So the antibodies tag it, and then the T lymphocytes can go in and kill it, which is pretty handy. There are 5 different classes of immunoglobulins, and they are listed in the table in the book. I'm not going to expect you to know those. That some of the different classes of antibodies do different tasks, but we're not going to get into that specific. There is another system that's called the complement system, and it involves a group of proteins that circulate in the blood. And when antibodies bind to antigens, it activates a sequence similar to a blood clotting cascade that results in the destruction of the antigen. It lyses the cell. And that's all we're going to say about the complement system. We're just not going to really get into that too deeply. There's only like a little paragraph on it in the book. Chemical mediators like histamines and cytokines may be involved in an immune reaction depending on the particular circumstances. A lot of times the chemical mediators are signalers. They are signaling a cellular response or some other type of response to the body. So sometimes they're signaling an an inflammatory response to open capillary beds to allow access for the immune cells into the interstitial space. So chemical mediators are basically cell messengers. You can think of them that way. So besides humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity, we have natural and artificial immunity. So natural immunity, and then we have active and passive of each one. So active is where your body's going to develop antibodies. Any kind of active immune response, your body's going to develop antibodies. So active natural immunity is natural exposure to an antigen and your body develops antibodies. So if you get we'll use the chicken pox as an example for both. When I was a kid, they didn't have a chickenpox vaccine. So you just had to get it. You just got the chickenpox. So you were naturally exposed to the antigen. You went over and played with your friend next door. They had chickenpox. You got it, and your body developed antibodies to it. And with the chickenpox, the antibodies hang around forever, or your B memory cells hang around forever. So one exposure gives you a future immunity to it. Now, and that's active natural immunity. So if I'm exposed to the chickenpox virus again, my body will say, I know that one, and it'll develop antibodies. Active artificial immunity is where the antigen is purposefully introduced to the body, like a vaccine. So now there's a chickenpox vaccine. You don't have to go and get it from the neighbor kid. You get the vaccine, you purposefully introduce that antigen in the body. It stimulates antibody production, and now you're immune to it. So that's artificial active immunity. So sometimes all it takes is that one exposure. So like the polio vaccine, you only have to have it once in your life. The chickenpox vaccine, you only have to have it once in your life. Mumps, usually just once. Some things you need booster immunization because it doesn't last. Some of the different, like the flu is always mutating. It's not that it doesn't last, it's just that it's a new virus. So viral ones are always kind of interesting. But so sometimes you need a booster, and we all know that. So besides active immunity, there's also passive immunity. So passive immunity has to do with antibodies. So or immunoglobulins, which are antibodies. So active immunity, you get exposed to an antigen either naturally or artificially, and your body develops the antibodies. Passive immunity, you get antibodies from someplace else, either naturally or artificially. So the way we naturally get antibodies for passive immunity is from our mother, either across the placenta or through breast milk. And because we're brand new, when we're newly born, we have a new immune system. We haven't developed immunity yet. And so the passive natural immunity that we get from our mother protects us for the first few weeks or months of life, until we can start developing our own immune system. So that's passive natural immunity. Passive artificial immunity is where you get an injection of antibodies, and it gives you short-term protection against whatever you were exposed to. So one of the a really interesting vaccine that involves passive artificial immunity and passive active immunity is the rabies vaccine. And I didn't know this until last year when somebody asked the question in class and we looked it up. So most vaccines, you get them before you get the disease, right? That's when you get a vaccine, it prevents you from getting the disease. And with rabies, they give you shots after you get exposed. So what's the deal with that? So we looked it up, and it turns out the rabies vaccine includes two things. One, it includes immunoglobulins against what you've already been exposed to. And two, it includes antigens that you're going to mount an immune response to. So one part of the vaccine addresses your current rabies infection, and the second part of it addresses future exposures. So that is very unusual. That is not a common thing that you see in vaccines, but that's just something I learned last year. So there's always more to learn. Isn't that great?